Hi, I'm Mark Wilson, the Engineering Heretic. And today I just want to have a bit of a discussion actually. I want to talk about the situation when it comes to engineering and tool making in Australia. Of course, I'm a tool maker. My background was mostly in plastic injection molding and primarily in the auto industry. And we built tools for many cars, the Holdens, the Fords you see around here. They're getting a bit old now. We don't make cars in this country anymore. But a little bit of history about what happened and why we no longer build cars anymore and the situation we find ourselves in. Of course, I started my apprenticeship in 1976 and finished my apprenticeship just before the end of that decade. Uh, we were building injection molds for the car industry mostly, but for any components basically that were around. The situation was things were made by pattern makers would make up a model of something. The drawings of the components were in a mylar form, like a plastic drawing. Nothing was digital, and we would get the patterns made up by a pattern maker, and we would then receive these patterns after many months, by the way, and of course then we'd rough out the die inserts and pantograph that shape in. Of course, I've mentioned before I have a pantograph myself, a ratio pantograph, only because I want to do curved shapes in my backyard and don't want to use CNC. I can't use CNC, but I don't choose to. It's not really something that's my thing much. Now, so that was the end of the 70s, and we carried on with the toolmaking industry, and consequently, I went and worked at a few other places and very similar work. And I met a girl, and she was Canadian, and I actually migrated to Canada in 1983 and spent 2 years post being married. Um, Working in Toronto, Canada, for basically the car industry as well. We were doing a couple of jobs I had. One was in a US military place in Toronto, building bits and pieces for military things and what have you. And then later on, I worked at a place that built blow molding things, making windscreen washer bottles and components and ducting components for the car industry. And I finished up there after a couple of years, and consequently, I don't like the cold much, so I decided I would. We were always going to move back here. My wife loves it in this country, and I like it too. So I'm more of an Aussie than I will ever be a Canadian, and I certainly don't ice skate, and I cannot ski, but I can swim. But that's my situation. When I got back to Australia, I had a couple of jobs back in the old jobs I had before I left, and by a number of events and things like that, changing a few jobs, I found myself working at a smallish tool making place that basically building injection molds for the car industry, a standalone tool making workshop, no molding facilities at all, and we were building molds for components for Robert Bosch, which have a plant here, or used to have a plant here in Melbourne, video instruments, and a number of other things catering to the car industry. So the moulders that would supply the second tier component makers like Video and Bosch, and then they'd pass them on to the different various cars. From about 1976 to about the year 1999, there's not a car on the road built in Australia that doesn't have bits and pieces of mouldings that I've had something to do with, be it the Nissans, the Camry, the Falcons, and Commodore cars and what have you. So that's about where I finished up with the auto industry around about the end of the year, end of 1999 into 2001. So what happened to the car industry? Well, a number of things. First of all, this country really has a very high standard of living and a small population on a big landmass. We also have lots of resources here, so we have lots of iron, lots of coal, lots of other rare earth minerals and all sorts of things like that. So we're always going to have a strong mining sector in this country. We supply something like about 60% of the world the world's iron ore comes out of Western Australia, pretty much, which is a huge amount. So what happened in the car industry? Well, I suppose that there's always been a collapsing wave behind manufacturing in this country. Uh, the dropping of tariffs post the Whitlam government in 1975 carried on to some degree. It then became no longer economically viable to build electronic goods in this country. So all of a sudden you could get cheap things made in Japan. And in fact, we were sort of amazed at how cheap things were. Once the tariffs were brought down, we could buy all sorts of things that we didn't even think were possible. And the the various companies that manufacture these televisions, radios, and things like that basically fell by the wayside, and that was before even the 80s. The car industry itself was a little bit protected. No car industry in the world doesn't survive without quite a big intervention by governments, and Australia is no different. And to protect our car industry, which was a post-war project, we had all this manufacturing stuff available, and we decided we started making the FJ or the FX Holden and so on and so forth in 1948, I think it was. And it required a fair bit of government intervention to make this all happen. We needed partners. We needed General Motors. We also needed Ford, which had a presence here, but they were the parent company of the two flagship companies we had here with Ford and Holden. And this was always under a bit of threat because we could never really export overseas. We did try. But the parent companies of Holden and of GM and Ford were never really going to allow us to produce things and supply to North America. We did occasionally, over time, supply a few things overseas. We supplied New Zealand with cars. But they were never going to allow us to compete directly with American car manufacturers because that's their own bread and butter in their own country. So it required a fair bit of protection to keep this going, and the tariffs were something like around about 25% on imported cars, and so with the cost of living and building tooling here, basically with the tariff protection, we were able to function and have quite a good standard of living for toolmakers. There was plenty of work around. But then, whilst I was overseas, of course, the Hawke-Keating government got into power, and of course they dropped the tariffs. They had a thing called the John Button Car Plan, which basically meant that over the next, I think every 8 years, the tariffs would drop by 5%. And so over from 1975-ish, 76, this plan has been put in place. Now, there are even higher taxes. There's something like about 30 or 40% on some of the luxury cars from Europe, so they were massively expensive. But every year, every 8 years or so, we were further exposed directly to cars made overseas, in particular Asia. We're talking Japan, of course, but later on there were cars made in other countries as well. So we're competing against them and against their standard of living. Rather soon after the tariffs were being dropped, we lost Nissan. We had a Nissan plant not far from where I live. We lost that within a couple of years, and that was gone. And we kept going with Mitsubishi. We had a plant in Adelaide, in South Australia. We also had Toyota here in Melbourne, and we also had Ford and Holden, which was obviously General Motors. And things went reasonably well for a while, but you could see things were getting more and more stressed as the tariffs were being dropped in these periodic arrangements. Then about I can't remember the times actually, maybe about 8 to 10 years ago, the Mitsubishi announced that they were going to pull up stumps in in Australia, and moved their plant back to back to Japan. And I think they also have cars built in other parts of Asia as well, probably Thailand. And so that left us with Toyota and of course Holden and Ford. Um, Now, as this was progressing, we have second-tier car manufacturers. We had a company called Autoliv doing seatbelt components, which came from the company Henderson Springs, and they would build seats for cars. We also had Nippon Denso here, making electrical components for cars, and Robert Bosch, mostly electrical components, alternators, starter motors, and things like that, and a number of others as well. Video Instruments, of course, making instrument panels. As time progressed, these second-tier suppliers were under stress, and of course, we were importing more components from overseas. So, as time progressed, things became more and more stressed, and of course, by around about 2002 or something like that, things really became very difficult, and the car industry, the second-tier manufacturers, uh, Autoliv, Henderson Springs, Video, they either moved offshore or bought their companies back under a German roof or somewhere in Asia. And of course, we lost that. And they would then ship these components to Australia. We would strike the main panels and things like that and do the assembly, but that's about all. So not a lot of work. Then then I suppose it became even more obvious when about 2000, the year 2000, 2001, we actually had oddly enough, we had three cars being remodeled at that time. There was a Camry, a Falcon, and a Commodore car were doing remodeling and changing lots of things. All things happened around about that year, and basically because we'd struggled along and a number of toolmaking places had closed down, basically Australia wasn't up to building all those tools anymore. We couldn't handle three new models being produced in the 1 year or so. Basically Australian toolmaking choked on it, and we couldn't do it. So that left us very compromised. And of course, with this pressure from tooling being built overseas, that was a big watershed moment for toolmaking. We had a lot of toolmaking companies go to the wall about that time. Too much work and not being paid and things like that. And that was really the writing was on the wall that we were in dire straits. About that time, I got out of toolmaking because it was just too stressful. I tried to retrain. I actually went to a local college and to retrain. I wanted to be a tool designer, component designer. If we couldn't build them here, I was going to do design work and design tooling, maybe built overseas. I went to a local college. It happened to be a Box Hill Institute, and of course, I was doing a diploma in engineering. I have a certificate 3 and other certificates in toolmaking, but I was doing a diploma in engineering because it was basically funded, and I was back full time. A little bit stressed about the finances because I didn't have a job at the time. But I really couldn't. I couldn't stay employed in toolmaking. So I'm back at a college, and I'm doing a diploma of engineering, and which I received. But during that time, the college I worked at had a workshop in a fitting and machining workshop, and a number of them, and a number of teachers in that field, and a few people had taken redundancies, and I was requested, by the way, could you possibly teach at this college? And I said, well, I don't have any qualifications, and they said, well, that's fine, we'll teach you, which they did. And over the next couple of years, instead of getting a job in finding something to do in design and CAD, I ended up with a full-time teaching position at a local college. I was teaching apprentices in fitting and machining. It was the basic course, core units for and apprentices. And of course, but none of these apprentices, or very few of them, were working in toolmaking. They're mostly doing fitting jobs and some machining jobs and things like that. But effectively, they were doing maintenance on various things. Maintenance on equipment, maintenance on machines, and some new stuff. And of course, the area I'm in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne is not the best corridor for manufacturing engineering. It's a little bit more south of us, down a place around near Dandenong, and there is a college down there that had substantially more students than we had. But even during this time, our apprentice numbers were drying up. There was not quite as much going on, and we're in the wrong corridor for attracting students to our campus for the 1 day a week in the first 3 years of their apprenticeship. So the numbers were dwindling, and I'd been there for about 10 years or so. And of course, being there 10 years and no work, I was offered a redundancy package. Basically, I was paid out, and I left that with quite a big golden handshake and no job. So I had to find something else, and I looked around at other colleges for possibly a place to teach. That wasn't forthcoming, so what I did was I retrained to do something else. And oddly enough, I looked around. I was probably a little bit disillusioned with manufacturing and fitting and turning and what have you. I was trying to get a job in something in services. So I looked around, and I wanted to work in something where I could use some of my skills, but in a services thing. So I looked at hospitals and what could I possibly do there. And I found that there was a job there called an operating theatre technician was what it was called, and I needed to have a qualification to do this. It was another Cert 3. And oddly enough, I ended up back at being unemployed at the time. I ended up being back at Box Hill doing a Cert 3 in, I forget what it's called, some periodic theatre technician job or something. I forget the name of it. Anyway, I got a Cert 3 there and consequently was looking for work, and I found a job in the city working at a private hospital setting up operating theatres for surgeries. So I go from being a toolmaker to being a teacher, and now I'm in operating theatres setting up, and oddly enough that particular hospital did a lot of neuro work, a lot of neurosurgeries and what have you, and I spent the next 2 years in this hospital setting up theatres, bringing in equipment, plugging them in, and yes, I was present while the surgeries were going. A lot of neurosurgeons were there, very well-known neurosurgeons in Melbourne, Australia, sometimes well-known around the world. So I'm in an operating theatre, plugging in equipment, making sure the patient's on the table, working with a team of people, but effectively a glorified orderly in some respects, but with a little bit more skills than that. And of course, my engineering skills were making sure the table was in the right spot, configured correctly, and things like that to do its job. Plugging in equipment and being a little bit more techno-savvy and things like that, making sure things worked. So I ended up there. And then because it was so far away and I was going into the city by train, I'd have thought, well, I'll see if I can get something a bit closer. And I always wanted something a bit more local. So I ended up getting a job at a more local public hospital. Not so much the neurosurgery, because neurosurgery is interesting and fun. You're with very complicated tables called a Jackson table, where the patient is usually lying face down. You've got to get them on the table. There's they call it an image intensifier, which is an X-ray machine, which needs to go underneath the patient, and that would actually make a 3D model of somebody's back in the theatre, and they could use that to guide screws from spinal fusions and things like that. Interesting and fun things, and I learnt a lot of things, and I learnt to deal with a few other things that I had never intended to experience. I did experience a few deaths on the table. That is a very rare occurrence, but there were a couple of them, and patients that are obviously in dire straits with not long to live, and things like that. I learnt a lot about life, and I learnt a lot about dealing with those issues. So I learned some skills that I never thought I'd have, and learnt to deal with the issue of death as well. Then I worked with this local, I got the job, this local job of mine. I was doing that for 4 years or so. And then I got a call, oddly enough, from an organisation that does skill migration assessment. So people overseas wanting to come to Australia, um, wishing to work here. And on our skilled migrations list, there are a number of skills we require. We have a diminishing population. Our birth rate is only 1.5 per couple. So we need migration. And on the government list, of course, the skills we require are, of course, in engineering, mechanical, and of course that includes toolmakers, machinists, fitters and turners, fitters, and a number of others. But I specialise in that field. And because I had a teaching qualification and an assessing qualification, I had the qualifications and skills to do both of these. And they made an offer to me that was just too good to refuse, and so I ended up becoming back, oddly enough, at a college and a branch arm of a college in the city, and doing assessments for skilled migration. So a candidate would apply for a particular qualification through our network. I would then vet their application, make sure they had a qualification, make sure they could prove they had a trade and experience. And then from that, we would set up usually an online interview. Sometimes they're in the country. There's a number of ways of doing this, but usually they're overseas. And from that interview, I would make an assessment based on my experience and my qualifications as to whether or not I believe they were and held or had something somewhere equivalent of a Cert 3 qualification. And so I ended up doing that and that's what I do now. And I do that 4 days a week. Oddly enough, I still actually like being a theatre technician, and I am still on my local hospital list as a casual, and occasionally I do shifts on the weekends and things like that. It's completely different than engineering. It's just you're in there. There's an operation going on. It could be a hip fusion or a hip replacement or something like that. Emergency appendix surgery. Just setting up something and being present with surgeons there, very, very skilled people and nurses and things like that. It's just a completely different environment, and I actually enjoy that. But I still love engineering even more. Of course, you've seen from my YouTube channel that I also have my workshop. I play around with clocks, as you see behind me here. I play around and I build and I fool around with clocks, so I play around with that. Okay. What happened during that time when I was in teaching and also in hospitals was the toolmaking industry completely collapsed. Toyota eventually went. Holden and Ford I think closed their doors in 2017. The last cars were ever manufactured here was 2017. And now we import all cars from overseas. It sounds sad, and it is, but there's a couple of reasons why we don't compete. First of all, our cost of living and our standard of living is extremely high, and we can't afford to pay people to do that type of manufacturing. That's the developing world to do that these days, and with tariffs and what have you being dropped, we have no protection against that. We do have wonderful, wonderful reserves of resources that we supply these countries to build these cars and what have you, but we don't do them in-house here. I think the biggest problem happened, actually, oddly enough, it was the global financial crisis that really, really set things in stone. During the global financial crisis, of course, China ramped up their production in order to head off a global disaster. We ramped up our mining. In fact, our mining boomed. And when things like that happen in Australia with only 25 odd million people, we don't have enough tradesmen to go around. We can't basically walk and chew gum at the same time. We only have enough people to service a manufacturing industry or a mining industry. We can't really move things around and do both. Other countries with bigger populations like the US, Europe and what have you, they can. We can't. And so during that time when things were booming in mining, of course, our manufacturing took a really went into a steep decline. And consequently, that was the end of the car industry. So now what we have in Australia is some manufacturing. We do some manufacturing, but it's all bespoke work. We do bespoke builds of trucks. We have a Kenworth DAF plant not far from my house. They do assembly work of trucks. They import most of the stuff. We make some things here, but effectively we work on stations where tradesmen, basically qualified tradesmen, experienced tradesmen, do assembly work and put things together on trucks and things like that. Bespoke work requires skills. That's where we do well. We do work in aerospace. A couple of our companies that used to work for the auto industry building production lines for cars swung themselves over to aeronautical things, and they work on things like the Joint Strike Fighter, the F-35, and things like that. So we ended up with a different thing, but it's bespoke. It's not a production line manufacturing country anymore. And so there is work for tradesmen, and we do 20, 30, maybe even 100 of components. We can special purpose build things that are very value added, machinery for food production lines and things like that, where the machinery is quite expensive, but it's only one machine. And once it's made, it's going to be used for many years and hardly change at all, requiring maintenance. Of course, that's where fitters come in. So that's the state of Australia. It's still a lovely place to live, but there's not a lot of high-end manufacturing, robots building cars and things like that. We don't do any of that. But it still is a place where we need fitters and repairers. You see things like cutting-edge engineering. Kurt from that organisation there does huge refurbishing of mining equipment and things like that. He does a lot of work there. That's the sort of work we do here, where and he's working on basically centralised and things like that. We do some CNC manufacturing, and most toolmakers in this country have swung over to the precision machining side of things. The toolmakers that were left. I think I only know one toolmaking company that's still in existence to these days, and I think he just works for himself. So you wouldn't ever try to build an injection mould in this country. I believe we still have a few places capable of doing it, but it's gone from this country. And so we have this sort of service industry of repairs, some manufacturing, bespoke manufacturing, and of course we service a mining sector, and that's mostly fitters. We do some very heavy mining machining. There's a couple of companies that do some very heavy work, both for here and overseas. But that's all very costly, expensive things. There's things that this country can afford to pay people to do with our standard of living. And that's the situation in Australia. I still love this country and what it does. The growth since I got back from Canada has been phenomenal. When I first came back from Canada, coming up 40 years ago, Melbourne was a sleepy little town. The CBD was about a square kilometre of a few high-rise buildings. These days, central Melbourne is one of the largest cities in Melbourne, a little bit smaller than Sydney. That little CBD is hardly distinguishable between all the other high-rises that have come up around it. We now have We're building underground train networks. We have tunnelling done for freeways and things like that. It is a thriving cosmopolitan city, and a very interesting one at that. So we have fitters that work in that field as well. There's still work for engineering people, a lot of work, but it's not manufacturing. And that's the situation in Australia. Lovely country, lovely people, come and visit us. And I'm Mark Wilson, and thanks for watching.